Well, my role is at Sun Life is, I do a lot of different things. Seems like everybody at every company has to wear a lot of hats these days. A third of my job is doing stuff like this, speaking to audiences like yourselves, to brokers, consultants, but actual decision makers. I prefer these presentations the most. A third of my time is spent in our home office in Wellesley. We're right outside of Boston, trying to help our business folks understand what's going on in DC and how that's going to affect what's going to happen to our own business at Sun Life. And a third of my time is spent in DC working with lawmakers across the country, mostly their staffs, but to really have them understand what the insurance industry wants out of Washington and how some of the things that have happened over the last few years, some of them have been good, some have been bad, but how we think we can move forward together a little bit better. And that's really what today is about. It's what's coming next from the Trump administration. And that's a difficult question to answer. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, there's certainly no denying that the president was a non-traditional candidate when he was running, and he's been a non-traditional president through the first 82 days. And that's what it's been. It's been 82 days. For some people it's felt longer, for some people it's felt shorter. But we're 82 days into his administration, and certainly over the next few weeks, you're going to hear quite a bit about what those first 100 days have meant. As we all know, those first 100 days are very important, and the Trump administration has had some challenges in those first 100 days. Ironically, coming from the Republican Party, has held back the president from some of what he's wanted to move forward. So what we're going to talk about today is what you're going to see over the next few days as we get to those 100 days, but what the next few years are going to look like, what the next 6 months, the next 18 months are most likely going to look like. What's hard about giving this presentation, as Bill mentioned in the beginning, is I don't have all the answers. No one has. Anyone that comes up here and tells you they have the answers, they don't. But what we can give you is the best guess of what we think is going to happen, educated guesses based on conversations and just what we're seeing both Democrats and Republicans looking to do. So the way I designed the presentation is we're gonna divide it into three parts. First, what we'll do is we'll talk about Congress. And the reason why we're going to spend some time on this is the challenges that the Trump administration have had moving certain legislation forward, particularly the American Health Care Act, really stem from sort of some of the challenges that Republicans have with themselves inside of the House and the Senate. And although you're hearing from the media, or maybe before a few weeks ago, you're hearing a lot about Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, President Trump in the Oval Office, they're going to be able to move legislation relatively easily. We've seen that it's even within the Republican Party, there's some disagreements on what should be first, what should move where. And so we'll talk about why that is, and then what that could mean for both the Affordable Care Act and also tax reform as well. Then we'll get into some of the priorities of the Trump administration. I'm going to spend just a minute on the Affordable Care Act in that section. We have a speaker later who's going to really dive into the details on that. But again, we'll talk about why the Republicans are having challenges with the repeal and replace that they're trying to put forward. And then we'll spend some time on some things that actually could happen in 2017, maybe early 2018. Believe it or not, paid family leave on a federal level, that's something that has bipartisan support. We'll talk about what that could look like if that goes into effect. That's probably an early 2018 piece of legislation. We'll talk about individual and corporate tax reform. I'll tell you why I'm not as excited about individual tax reform actually happening as many people are. I do think corporate tax reform is more likely than individual tax reform. We'll talk about what that could look like. Either way, I think the tax reform that what President Trump talked about for tax policy on the campaign trail is going to look very different from the tax policy that makes it through maybe the end of this year. For those of you that watched Fox Business this morning, I didn't, but I saw the clip. President Trump still wants to do the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace before he moves on to tax reform. We'll talk in this section about why that really isn't as likely given just the legislative calendar. And then finally what we'll do is we'll turn to 2018. And I know we're all electioned out. I know, I certainly was for a few weeks. But I love this stuff, so then I turned the page and started to look to 2018. And the reason why it's important is, you could actually argue 2018 started yesterday with the race in Kansas for that open House seats that the Republicans were able to hold on to. But the midterms in 2018, when you look at the Senate in particular, it's a really bad map for the Democrats. And this isn't Democrats are good or bad or Republicans are good or bad. When we go through this section, you'll see the Democrats just have more seats that they have to defend in the 2018 midterms in the Senate. And so the Republicans are really looking for a path to pick up 8 seats in those 2018 midterms. And if they're able to do that, and we'll talk about why they may or may not be able to, we could actually see more legislation in 2019 and 2020 move through Congress than we'll see in 2017 and 2018. So as you can see, there's a lot that we're going to cover in the next 40, 45 minutes or so. But as I go through the presentation, I'm more than happy to take any questions that you have. As Bill mentioned, if you want the slides for some reason, you're more than welcome to those as well. But again, if there's some I say that you disagree with, and there probably will be a few things that I do, please feel free to challenge me on anything, and we can keep this as conversational as possible. And again, just keep in the back of your mind, it might feel like at some points I'm sort of dumping on one party versus the other. It's going to be equal time in terms of what both parties are doing incorrectly. But this is really what is happening and sort of what is framing what's coming out of DC, which affects regardless of where you're from, it's gonna affect us. So we'll start off with Congress, and one thing that I think many of us, myself included, missed with if we go back to November 9th for a minute. So it's November 9th, President Trump wins, and then President-elect Trump at that point. And what we saw to both House and Senate Republicans, almost lockstep behind the president, saying we are behind his agenda. On day one, we want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. We want the president to have what he needs so that he can move his agenda through. And then as we got closer to January 20th, we started to see some of those factions in the Republican Party start to come out again. And maybe factions isn't the right word, but there are some pretty heavy ideological differences in the Republican Party, just like there are in the Democratic Party. But we're focused more on the Republican side of things, because what the president had really counted on, and what many congressional Republican leaders had counted on, is that Republicans would be united behind the president on certain pieces of legislation, repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act being one of those. And as we got closer to just a few weeks ago when the American Health Care Act bill was pulled, what really became apparent was groups like the Tuesday Group and the Freedom Caucus. Now, those are terms maybe that weren't thrown around as much before a few weeks ago. Those are going to be very influential groups that will influence whether or not certain legislation is going to go through. And these aren't huge numbers. I know it's kind of hard to read up there. The Republicans have about 240 seats in the House. They have a healthy majority there. But the reason why they were unable to pass the American Health Care Act is two of the groups that sort of just come together, meet, caucus together, whatever you want to call them, the Tuesday Group and the Freedom Caucus, they represent about 80 seats. Freedom Caucus in particular represents 30 seats. Freedom Caucus, more conservative part of the Republican Party. Tuesday Group, more moderate wing of the Republican Party. And all that infighting, remember that last week, right before that Friday vote got pulled, all the infighting and the changes that were happening to the American Health Care Act were really to try to get those two groups on board. The problem was they were on opposite sides of what they wanted to have happen. So every time something was changed that made the Freedom Caucus happy, it made the Tuesday Group unhappy. Every time something was put in place for the Tuesday Group, it made the Freedom Caucus unhappy. And so eventually Speaker Ryan realized he didn't have the 218 or 15, it depends on the day and who shows up and things like that, but he didn't have the votes needed in the Republican Party to get the American Health Care Act through. So what certainly has become apparent to the president and folks in his staff, and again, many of those are non-career politicians. You have the Vice President Pence folks, more career politicians, understand the system. You have more of the President Trump individuals that coming from Wall Street, coming from more of a business background that just, DC's a crazy place, whether it's right or wrong. There are just certain ways the system works down there. And certainly the president has realized that he is not going to be able to count on Republicans in the House, if he puts a piece of legislation in front of them, for them to be completely united. Now, that's just in the House. Really, this wasn't something that folks were too worried about on the Republican leadership side going into a few weeks before the American Health Care Act. What the president had wanted to do, and certainly this is a term you're hearing more and more of, and again, it illustrates some of the challenges that we're going to see from a legislative front over the next few months, is that Republicans have 52 seats in the Senate. So if you forget the House for a minute, and you just assume that the Republicans are going to vote the way the president needs them to in the House, even if all 52 Republicans are 100% behind the president all the time, most legislation in the Senate, you need 60 votes to actually get that legislation through. I know it doesn't make a ton of sense, and we saw this with the Supreme Court nomination just last week. Most legislation in the Senate, you need 60 senators to say, hey, we're going to end debate on this bill and we're going to move to actually voting on whether or not we want this bill to pass. Now, to vote on the bill, you only need 51 votes for it to pass, but to end debate, to end that filibuster, that term that certainly has come up more with the Supreme Court nomination, or now the Supreme Court confirmation, to overcome that filibuster, to end debate on the bill, you need 60 votes. So for most legislation that Congress is going to deal with this year, the Senate in particular, 8 Democrats are going to have to cross the aisle and say, hey, we might not vote for the legislation, but we're at least going to vote to end debate on the legislation to then decide whether it's going to be that straight up and down vote. And so what happened in the Supreme Court, and this is not part of this presentation, but just to give you a sense of why that was so controversial, is back in 2013, the Republicans in the Senate started to use the filibuster to make it so that President Obama's judicial nominees weren't confirmed. Really up to 2013, judicial nominees weren't, and I'm not talking about Supreme Court nominees, I'm talking about appellate judges, more federal level judges. Having judges appointed wasn't that controversial. The Republicans started to use this and say, no, we need 60 votes before we can vote on this appeals judge in Illinois or this appeals judge in Florida. And so the Democrats got frustrated by that. And so they changed the rules, which you can do with a simple majority. This is just the way it works. And so they said, you know what, for every judge up until the Supreme Court nominee, we're going to change the rules so that you don't need 60 votes anymore to end debate. It's just going to be a straight up and down 51 vote to decide if that justice is going to go through. And so then earlier this year, or just a few weeks ago, I should say, when the Democrats said, hey, no, you need 60 votes to get a Supreme Court nominee through, we are going to use the filibuster to make sure that Justice Gorsuch's nomination doesn't go through, the Republicans said, hey, listen, you guys, God bless you, you guys changed the rules in 2013 for every judge up to the Supreme Court. We are now going to change the rules, so all the way up to the Supreme Court, you don't need 60 votes anymore. It's just going to be a straight up and down vote to get that. So now all judicial nominees only need a straight up and down vote. Now, the reason I spend any time on this at all is most other pieces of legislation, you still need those 60 votes, except there is this little window called budget reconciliation. And budget reconciliation allows a party, I'll talk about the rules about it in a moment, but you don't need 60 votes to end debate to move to that final vote. There's a time limit on the debate, and then you move to that final vote. So if the Republicans can use, and this is no different, we'll talk about the Democrats, have used this in the past too. If the Republicans can use budget reconciliation, well, now they don't have to get any Democrats to cross the aisle in the Senate. With their 52 votes, they can move legislation forward because they only need 51 for it to actually pass. So again, not that this is civics class or anything like that, it might bring it back to school a little bit, but this is the stuff that matters right now. Real procedural, down and dirty, really, things, parliamentary tactics, that's what, Congress has come down to these days. And so budget reconciliation is very important. Now, the thing about budget reconciliation, and this actually, believe it or not, this is all going to tie together with the Affordable Care Act and health and tax reform in a moment. But with budget reconciliation, you can only use it once a year. You can only use it once a budget year is a better way to say that. So for the 2016 budget year, you can use it once. For the 2017 budget year, you can use it once. It has to relate to revenue. And in particular, it can't increase the deficit over the long term. Now, in the long term in the DC world is 10 years. So it's a piece of legislation that has to deal with revenue once a year, can't increase the deficit over a 10-year period. It can increase the deficit over a 10-year period. It cannot increase the deficit over an 11-year period. So it can't increase the deficit over a period over 10. It's just the way it works in D.C. So that's sort of what budget reconciliation is. Now, both parties will say, when they're in the minority, that budget reconciliation is horrible. And no one should use it, and it's not fair, and it's outside of the normal process. So Democrats don't like budget reconciliation right now. But both Democrats and Republicans, over the last, reconciliation came into effect in '74. It's been used 26 times since 1974. So it's relatively common. And big pieces of legislation that and you may have liked or not liked, they used budget reconciliation. So the Bush tax cuts back in 2001 and 2003, that used budget reconciliation to be passed. The Democrats, they couldn't get to the 60, the Republicans couldn't get to the 60 votes they needed to overcome the normal filibuster. They used the budget reconciliation process. This was controversial because remember, you can't increase the deficit past a 10-year period. And so think back to the end of 2012. Everyone in here was reading articles about the fiscal cliff. The world was going to end because the Bush tax cuts were set to expire. They were set to expire because tax cuts, we can sort of argue about this economically, but tax cuts reduce revenue. Your tax rates go down. The idea is the economic growth will bring in the missing dollars. But to get this through, the Republicans put a sunset provision so that January 31st, 2012, the Bush tax cuts were scheduled to expire. Now, in actuality, most of them were extended. In January, President Obama signed that legislation, but that's why there was all that controversy back in 2012, because reconciliation was used to put the Bush tax cuts through. And remember that for a minute, because this potentially could be an avenue that the Trump administration tries to use. So we could see another 10-year tax bill that's then set to expire, which sets us up in 10 years for all this crazy controversy. But just to again be fair, the Democrats have used budget reconciliation very controversially over the years, particularly back in 2010. If you remember, the Affordable Care Act at the end had to use budget reconciliation to cross the finish line. And the reason for that, I'm from Massachusetts, so I know this story very well. God bless you. Senator Kennedy passed away. The Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate. Senator Kennedy passed away, and we elected Senator Scott Brown that gave the Republicans that 41st vote. That took away that supermajority, so to speak, from the Democrats. And so at the end, the Democratic Party had to use budget reconciliation to put the Affordable Care Act over the finish line. And that was controversial because you may remember the way that the Congressional Budget Office, they're sort of the scorekeepers in D.C., so to speak, they scored the law to say the Affordable Care Act would decrease the deficit over a 10-year period. Now, that has not actually turned out to be the way that it worked, and there was a lot of controversy over how they scored the law to make it fit into the reconciliation process. So, again, you're going to hear a lot from Democrats about reconciliation isn't fair. Both parties do the same thing. When they're the minority, they don't like it because the filibuster is taken away from them. But both parties have used big pieces of major legislation and put it through the budget reconciliation process. The challenge with reconciliation for Republicans today is you need everybody on the same page. And this is what happened with the American Health Care Act. The Republicans were using reconciliation. They didn't even make it to the Senate. They couldn't get the 200, it says 215, 218, again, depends on what the number is, but they couldn't get the 215 or so votes that they needed to move the legislation forward. And then we were hearing Republicans in the Senate saying, hey, listen, we're not so sure we like that American Health Care Act as well. You had Senator Paul, a number of others as well. And you can only lose two senators, really three senators in the Senate, or budget reconciliation isn't going to be used. So again, when you think back to 2001, 2003 of the Affordable Care Act, regardless of the politics, you think it was better or worse at the time, both parties had their people on the same page and were able to move them forward together as a unit, something that the Republicans did not have with the American Health Care Act. This was a big, don't let anybody convince you otherwise. This was a major problem for the Trump administration that they were unable to get the American Health Care Act through before April 28th, which is coming up soon. You might say, what the heck does April 28th have to do with anything? Well, April 28th matters because the 2016 fiscal year ends on April 28th. And it's sort of more complex than this, but 2017 is kind of a unique year where there's going to be two budget years. 2016's fiscal year is going to end on April 28th, and 2017's fiscal year is going to begin the day after, which, by the way, is why when you're hearing, oh, there might be a government shutdown, when Congress comes back on April 24th, their absolute number one priority is to fund the government past April 28th, because it's not funded right now past April 28th. So there should be heavy drinking during this presentation, make people feel better. But there is a chance that we'll see a government shutdown after April 28th. But it's going to be their first priority when they come back on the 24th. But before April 28th, what President Trump had wanted to do, this was the original plan. Day one, November 9th, they say, this is great. We're going to have two bites at the apple. We can use budget reconciliation twice in 2017, and we can really push two very important things forward. So plan number one was use the 2016 fiscal year reconciliation process to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. So that was going to happen 2 weeks ago. Before April 28th, they were all set up for it. House was going to pass it, move to the Senate, boom. We're going to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act using reconciliation before April 28th in that 2016 fiscal year reconciliation. Then we're going to use 2017's budget reconciliation window to do tax reform. So this was really the opportunity for the president. This is what he wanted to do. 2017, I get two big pieces of my agenda through. Repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, put tax reform through. I can use budget reconciliation twice in this calendar year, just kind of a unique situation, big wins. And so that's when the days leading up, but even still today, when you hear the president and some Republican leaders talk about the Affordable Care Act and tax reform, they say, well, we got to do the health care stuff first, and then tax reform second. And that's when when the bill was pulled a few weeks ago, that's when you hear the president say, well, we're done with the Affordable Care. We're moving on to tax reform. Now, we sort of walked that back a little bit since then. But the reason is, if the Republicans don't get, and it's over. They're on recess for the next 2 weeks. They come back on April 24th. There's not enough time for this to happen. That's why even before they went on recess, there was all that back and forth between the vice president and the speaker and the Freedom Caucus to figure out could they actually come together before recess to get something voted on in the House. The Affordable Care Act is going to have some tweaks, and the presenter later is going to talk a little bit more about what those tweaks are going to be. But that's what it's going to be, tweaks for 2017. Now, there could be bigger changes in 2018, but because they weren't able, or because the Republicans weren't able to do this before April 28th, you're not going to see the repeal and replace. Because, again, they needed budget reconciliation because there's not enough Democrats that are going to come on board to vote and say, yes, we want to repeal and replace the law. So now the new strategy, again, it's hard to say, but it seems like the president's turned the page. Again, not publicly saying this, but in certain places he is, turn the page and we'll really start to focus on tax reform when they come, tax reform and use that 2017 reconciliation opportunity for tax reform. So again, I know that is way wonkier and like way more detailed than maybe you had anticipated getting when you signed up for this session, but that's the reality of what's going on today. April 28th was a very, very important date. Everyone's had that circled on their calendar for months. And once the American Health Care Act legislation fell through, it was, geez, do they have enough time till April 28th? And then are they going to move forward with the 2-week recess, which they're on right now and next week? The answer to that is yes. And it's like, well, if they're coming back on April 24th and they got to get a budget resolution by April 28th, there's no more time to repeal and replace the American Health Care Act using 2016's budget reconciliation period. And so, you know, the real challenge around repealing and replacing the law, and again, Larry this afternoon is going to go into more of the details, but, you know, I think it's worth mentioning. I thought, you know, this is just my own personal non-Sun Life opinion. I think Speaker Ryan did a pretty good job with the American Health Care Act legislation when you take a look at it from his perspective. He had two big issues that he's been struggling with. Really, the Republican Party has been struggling with since 2010. The first is Medicaid expansion. Illinois is an example. Massachusetts is an example. There's 31 states that have expanded their Medicaid program. And whether you're in favor of that or not, what that's meant is the Medicaid program has grown. And the 31 states that have expanded their Medicaid program, and I should take a step back, the way, and it's a little more complicated than this, but the way Medicaid generally worked before the Affordable Care Act was states could cover individuals up to 100% of the federal poverty level. And then the Affordable Care Act said every state has to raise their eligibility to 133% of the federal poverty level. When the law went to the Supreme Court for the first time in 2012, that was the only part of the law that was held unconstitutional. You can't force states, the Supreme Court said, to expand their Medicaid program. So it became optional. So 31 states have expanded at this point. And since expansion began in 2014, there are 11 million individuals that are between 100 and 133% of the federal poverty number that are now enrolled in Medicaid. So in those 31 states, there's these 11 million folks that are in this expanded Medicaid population. So that's really been challenge number one for the Republicans. And we saw that in the American Health Care Act plan. What do you do with those? And I understand these are real people, and I throw on the number. It's a big number. But what do you do with those 11 million individuals? If you repeal the law 100%, the expanded Medicaid eligibility goes away. Oh, and by the way, the federal government pays a significant 90% at this point of the expanded Medicaid population's costs, higher than they do for regular Medicaid, actually. And so the idea is if you repeal the Affordable Care Act, the expansion goes away and the funding goes away. So then you have these 11 million individuals that they got to find coverage somewhere else. Now again, they're not paying for it. The government's paying it for them, but they have coverage today and they didn't have it prior to the law. The second issue for the Republicans is that the public exchanges have not worked well. They have not worked well at all. In 2017, there were supposed to be 25 million Americans or individuals that were enrolled on the public exchanges getting their health insurance. The reality is it's closer to 12 million in 2017 that will be enrolled on the exchanges. The end of the year, it'll probably end up around probably 11.5 or 11. But what the exchanges have done is they have created a heavily subsidized population of individuals that are getting coverage, and the government on average is paying 72% of the premium. So of the 12 million individuals that are on the exchanges, about 9 million of them are getting a tax credit or subsidy from the federal government that on average pays 72% of their premiums. So yes, when you read the stories about New Mexico or Arizona, we've all seen the stat, the exchanges in Arizona, premiums have gone up 100, 120%. True. Most people on the exchanges don't pay 100% of the premiums, and as the premiums go up, so do the subsidies, because they're all tied to a percentage of income. So, the HHS came out last summer with, sort of this quiet note that said, yeah, paraphrasing, but, yeah, we know that the numbers are going up, but as you know, the subsidies go up proportionally, so, even though premiums are going up 100%, so are subsidies in those areas as well. So the fact is there's a heavily subsidized population, about 9 million individuals, that are getting coverage on the exchanges, and on average they're getting 72% of their premium paid for. Again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but these are the challenges the Republicans have. What do you do with these two populations? Individuals are on Medicaid today that wouldn't be if the Affordable Care Act is gone, and if you repeal and replace the law, what do you do with these individuals that are getting their coverage on the exchanges and getting almost 3/4 of their premiums paid for? And so again, Larry this afternoon is going to go into why the American Health Care Act didn't work, but that's what Speaker Ryan put together. He put together a plan that at least phased out Medicaid by 2020. At least it kept, if you were on the expanded population, you could stay on it. For the exchanges, he created a new system that had tax credits, a little bit different than we're today. But Speaker Ryan had to come up with a plan that he felt would not throw more individuals onto the uninsured rolls. And in fairness, the CBO or the Congressional Budget Office didn't exactly agree with that, but I thought he came close to it. What was frustrating for Republicans, Republican leadership, is if you go back to 2015, again, this wasn't very well covered in the media, and it wasn't because they were pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. It didn't matter. But back in 2015, the Restoring Americans Healthcare Freedom Act passed the House and the Senate, and went to President Obama, was vetoed. But in 2015, don't ever let anybody tell you the Republicans didn't have a repeal and replace plan that they put on President Obama's desk, because they did. In 2015, they passed a law that would have repealed everything. Individual mandates were gone. Employer mandates were gone. Every tax was repealed. But what they did is they created 2 wind-down periods, 24 months for Medicaid expansion, 24 months for the public exchanges. Essentially what that would have meant is, this was in 2015, so January 1st, 2018, Medicaid expansion's closed. If you're on it, figure it out. Sorry, you had two years to figure it out. You're on the exchanges, no problem. Your tax credits, your subsidies, those are going to exist for the next 24 months. January 1st, 2018, figure it out. You're going to have to find new health insurance. I'm being a little dramatic there, but that's essentially how it would work. It created a wind-down period. What was frustrating for House and Senate Republican leadership is 240 Republicans in the House voted for this bill, including every single member of the Freedom Caucus. This bill, I'll send it to you. They passed a law that would have done similar things to what the American Health Care Act would have done. And so what'll be interesting to see is if President Trump really follows through on his threat to the Freedom Caucus folks, is, did you only vote for this because you knew it wasn't going to go anywhere? Obviously, President Obama was going to veto the bill, which he did. Republicans used reconciliation to get this on his desk in 2015. Did you really only do this as a political move? Because then you could have actually repealed and replaced the law, and you voted against it. So if you're willing to vote for this in 2015, same people, why aren't you willing to vote for a plan that's similar? It's different, but it's similar in 2017. So what's ironic is that, what the Democrats, they had a very interesting strategy with the American Health Care Act situation. And we could certainly argue about, the impact of Democrats on certain Republican town halls, and I'm certainly not going, down that path. But generally speaking, Democrats didn't do too much with the American Health Care Act. They let the Republicans sort of fight it out amongst themselves and then not be able to come up with the votes. And again, this is what's driving Republicans, particularly Republican strategists, crazy. They passed a bill in 2015. The same people that voted against the American Health Care Act, they voted for this bill that would have repealed the Affordable Care Act 100% essentially just a few years earlier. What's also frustrating some Republicans is President Trump has a very clear idea of what he wants to do, and it's a one-step repeal and replace. And what this particular bill would have done is it would have, if let's say it would have passed in 2015, it would have created a two-step repeal and replace. And so there are many Republicans that want to do a two-step, which would be, okay, we use reconciliation to repeal most of the law, but we have a wind-down period, so everything sort of stays in effect for 18, 24, 36 months, but we say at some date in the future, everything's done. And we use budget reconciliation for that. And then we put pressure on the Democrats, and we say, hey, listen, I'm making this number up, but 1/1/20, the Affordable Care Act's going away. It's going to stay the same exactly, but then 1/1/20, it's gone. You better come to the table and work with us on a bipartisan solution so we don't have to use budget reconciliation, but we got to come up with a replacement plan together. Some Republicans don't like this because then it creates this sort of a new fiscal cliff, a health care cliff, so to speak, where there's a date in the future where the Affordable Care Act goes away, and there's going to be this brutal last-minute scrambling, like everything in Washington, to put a replacement in place. But this would have been an easier path for the Republicans to be able to repeal and replace before that April 28th date. Repeal in one bill, replace in the future, but the president really wanted to have that one-step repeal and replace, and that's what's really tied up the Republicans today. So the sad thing is, maybe it's not a sad thing, but this is really how things are working today down there. It's not good. Even within parties, they're having their own challenges, and everything has come down to sort of last-minute showdowns. Now, the good news is there are some things that have bipartisan support, believe it or not. There are a number of things that have bipartisan support. One of them is paid. Oh, actually, before I leave this, one more point on this. If I was in your shoes, where I would be frustrated, there's many reasons why I'd be frustrated, but one of the reasons I'd be frustrated is you still have on your books that the Cadillac tax is going to kick in 1/1/20. And the good news is we now have 100% confirmation that there are neither Democrats nor Republicans that want anything to do with the Cadillac tax going into effect. And the reason why I can say that is because the American Health Care Act delayed the Cadillac tax at first until 2025, and then the very last iteration until 2026. You might say, well, James, why does that mean they don't want anything to do with it? Because Republicans were actually very open about the fact that they only kept the Cadillac tax on the books for the projected revenue that it was supposed to go in. So again, I'm not saying this is the right way to run the country or this is the way to run the Senate or the House, but when the Congressional Budget Office, these are the folks that crunch all the numbers for the government. Again, when you want to use budget reconciliation, you want to make sure you're not increasing the deficit past a 10-year period. And so by keeping the Cadillac tax on the books, it actually doesn't, even going back to the Democrats do the same thing, it doesn't matter, it matters in real life, but it doesn't matter in Congress whether any money from any of the Cadillac tax ever comes in. What matters is when you run a 10-year projection, in 2025, there's supposed to be money coming in. In 2026, there's supposed to be money coming in because the government runs everything off of 10-year numbers. So when you think when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, Cadillac tax went into effect 2018, way down the road. Who knows what's going to happen then? But when the Congressional Budget Office was scoring the law, they said in 2018, 2019, and 2020, it's going to be $87 billion that comes in from the Cadillac tax. Nobody really expected that money to come in, but it made the numbers work for the Democrats. Then in 2015, when the Cadillac tax was delayed to 2020, there was bipartisan support to repeal the Cadillac tax. There was a different bill that could have gone through. The Democrats decided to keep the Cadillac tax on the books because, God bless you, they wanted the projected revenue to stay on the books in 2021, 2022, going forward. And so then when the Republicans had their chance with their repeal and replace plan to get rid of the Cadillac tax, they left it on the books. Why? Not because they wanted to go into effect, because they liked the projected revenue in 2025 and 2026 that made the legislation look less expensive than it was. Again, I'm not saying this is the right way to do things or not, but if you wonder why we have a $20 trillion debt, it's because the government's run on 10-year numbers, but nobody ever checks to see if the revenue comes in. It's all based on the point in time for the 10 years forward. So the good news, though, but this is supposed to be the good news section. The good news for you is, and certainly you want to talk with Bill and his folks about this, but you want to plan for the Cadillac tax just in case. But it's very unlikely that it ever kicks in, even if it's going to be a last-second thing. Nobody likes it. Democrats, Republicans, we're all on the same page on that. Economists like it. Certainly, both think tanks like it, but politicians understand it's not a good idea. So Cadillac tax is there, but we're probably going to see it pushed back and whatever happens. So you still have to plan for it, but there's all those disclosures in your folder. But I wouldn't feel too nervous about the Cadillac tax actually coming into effect. So ironically, Cadillac tax, bipartisan support, nobody likes it, but they like the revenue attached to it, projected revenue, I should say. So they want to keep pushing that off. Paid family leave has bipartisan support as well, believe it or not. It was a break from traditional Republican platforms to have then candidate Trump have a paid family leave proposal in his campaign. Now, his leave proposal versus Secretary Clinton's leave proposal, very, very different. But why Republicans like the president's proposal is, and he's now president, I should take out the elect there, but the reason why they like the president's proposal is that it pays for itself in his economist's mind. So it's a bare bone proposal. It's 6 weeks, mother only, at birth, available to individuals that don't have short-term disability that pays them 6 weeks, 60%. The reason why this is liked by Republicans is the president feels like there's so much fraud in the federal unemployment system that if you cleaned that up and you had this administered by the federal unemployment folks, it would pay for itself. The fraud in the unemployment system would pay for it because, again, remember, if you have a 6-week, 60% benefit, you're not eligible for this. Now, I know you have a lot of questions. What does it mean, eligible? Who are my employees? The details are not there yet. It's a very bare bones proposal. Could it be that if you offer your employees a 6-week, 60% and they don't take it, say it's a purely voluntary benefit, it sounds like they would not be eligible for this if you offered that to them. Again, there's a lot of details that haven't been worked out. But Democrats don't love this proposal. Again, Secretary Clinton's was very robust, 12 weeks, father, a lot of things were covered, but it was expensive. And there was going to have to be new tax revenue to pay for that. This is in theory, revenue neutral. And so Republicans can get behind it. And Democrats, again, they don't like how, in their mind, bare bones it is, but they like having a paid family leave law go on the books. And the idea is it's going to be much easier to change this law in the future than it is going to be to have a Republican president that is looking to get a paid family leave law on the books. Now, how this interacts, some of the state, municipality leave laws that are out there, unclear. It looks like this would be a floor, a minimum, and they would work in concert with those others. Now, the reason why this is, why many people, myself included, feel like this has the most legs is that if you think back to the campaign, Ivanka Trump was the person that was outlining this plan in the media. She was doing the media tour. She was really pushing it. This is important to Ivanka Trump. We'll see when we look at the individual tax proposals. You can see her footprint, or fingerprint, so to speak, on these plans. And I don't think, again, this is not a controversial statement. What is important to Ivanka Trump seems to be important to the president. She now has an office in the White House. This is something that she's trying to rally business leaders around to get them to understand the value of it. Again, it's pretty bare bones, but it would be a step forward. So Democrats are willing to deal with. They don't like it. They think it's not aggressive enough, but they'd like to have something on the books. Republicans are okay with it because, in theory, it pays for itself. And it's not as aggressive. Now, again, we'll have to see how this interacts with the insurance industry and what it means for the benefits that you're offering. But this is probably a late 2017, early 2018 type proposal. They're still working on it. But this has bipartisan support. This could be something we see the president talk about, particularly. I knew I made this Cadillac tax slide, but I was supposed to put it in front. But this is all the stuff I already told you. But, we'll have to see how tax reform turns out. But paid family leave is something, tax reform or not, that is something that the president has certainly, at least through Ivanka Trump, made important. Now, on the individual tax side, this is where it gets tough. This is a pretty simplified program that the president has talked about. Now, this is what he talked about on the campaign trail. We're going to 3 brackets. You go to 12, 25, and 33. You increase the standard deductions. You take away a lot of other deductions. You create some interesting new ones as well. Again, this is where you see Ivanka Trump's fingerprints. I like this. It's a new child care deduction. So essentially what it would be is whether you're a stay-at-home parent or you're paying for daycare for your children, you're going to be able to get a tax deduction. Is it a credit or a deduction? Yes, a deduction on your income. So that would mean that if you're a stay-at-home parent, you're not paying for child care, but you're doing something. It's valuable. You should get the benefit as if you were paying for child care. So I like that it sort of makes it a more tax neutral thing if you want to stay home or if you want to send your child to daycare. The other thing that again some Republicans like and don't like in here is it would remove the estate tax. And that might sound, well, that really just helps upper income individuals. But what it would do is it would change it would change how you inherit property. So essentially the way it works today is, let's say that your parent bought a stock at $10,000 and it went to, or anyone bought a stock for $10,000, went to $100,000 and they passed away, and you inherited it. The $90,000 of gain gets wiped away. It's called the step up in basis. And then you could sell the stock tomorrow and you don't pay any capital gains. It's great. Now, what the president is talking about is changing that, so if you inherit the stock, you inherit the $90,000 of capital gains, and if you want to sell it, well, that's fine. You pay the capital gains on the $90,000. So the estate tax goes away, which is at a 35 to 45% rate, and it's traded in for a capital gains rate, which can be anywhere up to 24%. Some Republicans don't like that, but I actually think it's a little bit more of a fairer system. The problem with this proposal, and why I'm not as bullish on it as other people are, is you have both conservative and more liberal tax think tanks in D.C. that have scored this and said, this is, let me take a step back. And I'm not going down this path either, but the people who make the most money in this country, generally speaking, pay the most amount in tax dollars, in the dollars that they pay. And this particular plan, again, coming from both conservative and liberal think tanks, this benefits upper income individuals from a percentage basis and an absolute dollar basis more than middle income or lower income individuals. Now, again, you can look at that a number of different ways. If you make the most amount of money, you pay the most amount of taxes. Of course, a tax cut is going to impact you positively. Democrats have already said we're not voting for any tax plan that gives more tax breaks to upper income earners than middle income earners, at least percentage-wise. This particular plan would not do that. Also, Republicans have said, we want to make sure that it's a fairer system, but we don't want to see the upper income individuals get as great of a tax break as it looks like here. Also, Republicans are coming out against this plan, not even Democrats, Republicans, because only, and I say this, it's not a joke, but only the president's economists feel like this particular tax plan would raise the revenue that the lost tax revenue would take away. So both Democratic and Republican think tanks have looked at this plan and said this possibly would add $3 to $5 trillion to the debt over a 10-year period from the revenue that it would take away. And only the president's economists have come out and said, no, it's revenue neutral because of the growth that would come from the economy from this plan. So the president's got some challenges with this. It looks like probably in May he's going to come out with a more formal proposal. It probably looks similar to this, but maybe he will make some moves. Now, on the corporate tax side, I am more, I'm feeling better about corporate tax reform going through for a number of reasons. One, as important as paid family leave is to Ivanka, corporate tax reform is important to the president. This is very important for him. We've already seen he's very involved with businesses. He's not afraid to let them know his opinion on what, the way some of their operations should be. He would like to see a lower corporate tax rate. That's what he's hearing back from CEOs when he meets with them. Now, the president's plan will be a 15% corporate tax rate from the 35 today, and also a 10% one-time repatriation. The way that works is essentially depends on who you believe. There's anywhere between $3 to $5 trillion that U.S. companies have overseas, and they keep them overseas because if they brought them back to the U.S., they'd be taxed at the 35% corporate tax rate. So the idea is if you had this one-time repatriation allowance at a lower tax rate, these companies would bring all this money back in at the lower tax rate. That would stimulate the economy. Now, Speaker Ryan's plan is a little bit higher than this. His plan is a 20% corporate tax rate, 15% repatriation. There is some talk now that given that the Affordable Care Act is still on the books, and again, doesn't look like we're going to see that full repeal and replace, there was some tax revenue there that the government had sort of assumed they were going to get cut from there, that maybe 28% is a realistic corporate tax rate at this point for what we'll see. But even, and I'm sure many of you in the room will agree, 28 is probably better than 35. For an individual, for pass-through entities, maximum rate of 25% has been talked about. So there is bipartisan support, again, to have corporate tax reform. Senator Schumer's on the record is saying, hey, let's talk about this. Let's get to a number. So it's probably not 15. It's probably not 20. Maybe 23, 24, 25 is what we're seeing. Again, maybe even as high as 28. But it does look like out of any tax proposal that we'd see that would go through this year, corporate tax reform ironically has, or maybe not ironically, but has more has a better tailwind than individual tax reform. So again, there's still a lot to be decided on both of those, but individual tax reform is going to be tough. Corporate tax reform could be a little bit easier. All I'd say to you as you think about how corporate tax reform could affect you, and I've certainly said this to our corporate finance folks as well, if we go from a 35 to a 28% rate, or 35 to a 25 or 20, whatever rate you want to have, we're not going to be able to take the same deductions at 28 or 25 or 20 as we took at 35. So what the real corporate tax fight might come down to is different industries and interest groups really trying to fight to keep their deductions in place. The overall net number is going to be lower, but your industry could be better or worse impacted depending on what deductions stay in place. So again, 35 to 28 sounds great, but it's not like it's going to carry forward all those deductions as well. So last thing I'll talk about, just two quick slides on this, are turning to 2018. And again, the reason why 2018 is so important is if you remember, the Republicans had those 52 seats in the Senate. If they were able to pick up 8 seats in the midterms, they'd have 60, and then all that filibuster, all that crazy stuff I spent like an hour talking to you about doesn't matter anymore. In the Senate, they can move things whatever they want. In fact, if the president was able to pick up, or if the Republicans were able to pick up 8 seats in 2018, we're looking just like we were in 2008. President Obama had a supermajority in the Senate, majority in the House. President Trump would have a supermajority in the Senate, supermajority in the House. And by supermajority, I mean 60 seats. Now, this chart's a lot of crazy stuff going on here. People say, James, 8 seats is a lot of seats. There's no way the Republicans are going to be able to pick up 8 seats. Well, again, the map is just not good for the Democrats in 2018. And some years the map's good for the Democrats, some years it's good for the Republicans. It's a good map for the Republicans this year. The Democrats have 25 Senate seats that are up for re-election in the 2018 midterms. The Republicans only have 8. And when you go back to 2014, it was a similar map. It was a little bit better for the Democrats that year. They had 21 seats they had to defend. Republicans only had to defend 15. The Republicans picked up 9 seats in 2014. So the 21 seats the Democrats had to defend, the Republicans picked up 9. So 8 is not a crazy number. I know it sounds like a lot, but 8 is a number that could happen. Now, if you had heard me speak last year, boy, was I wrong on a lot of stuff last year. But a lot of people were, in fairness. But when you look at that 2016 number, you would have heard me say, well, the Democrats have 10 seats they have to defend. They're not going to lose any of those. I was right on that. But of the 24 seats that the Republicans had to defend, I mean, the sort of conservative estimate was the Democrats would pick up at least 4, maybe 6, but at least 4. And of course, they only picked up 2 here in Illinois and in New Hampshire. Really what everyone, myself included, missed. One, a lot of the polls were wrong, and that set me up for a lot of failure. But more importantly, there was a misconception that was just 100% incorrect, that President Trump would have a negative, then candidate Trump, would have a negative down ballot impact. So in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states that had senators that were up for re-election, the idea was the Republicans in those states are not going to turn out, and President Trump, or candidate Trump's not going to win there anyways. The Democrats are going to pick up Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And of course, that was totally wrong. And President Trump had a very positive impact on down ballot Republicans. So Democrats only picked up 2 seats in 2016. But the reason why 2016 and 2018 are going to be different in terms of why I feel more confident in the Republicans being able to pick up at least 4 or 5 seats is when you look at this map, and it'll get a lot of stuff up here. Republicans are looking to what some people are calling the Trump trail. So there are 10 of the 25 seats that the Democrats have to defend are in states that President Trump won in 2016. And these are all, some are battleground states, but some are real red states. States like North Dakota, Montana, West Virginia, Indiana, Missouri. I mean, these are more traditionally Republican states that Democrats have to defend seats in. And then there are some of those battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Minnesota, which didn't go over to President Trump, was closer than people thought. There are some seats that the Democrats are very concerned about in 2018, mostly because there's so many seats up in states that either went for President Trump or were closer for the president. So this, you could argue that 2018 will give us a good sense on the president's approval rating, so to speak, his popularity, depending on what happens both in the House and in the Senate as well. But make no mistake, I know, folks outside of D.C. Maybe aren't focusing too much on the 2018 midterms, but certainly the folks in D.C., the strategists on both sides, are very laser focused on 2018. So I know we talked about a lot and I certainly appreciate the attention. But I think the key takeaways are this is going to continue to be news cycle to news cycle, things change. But what's sort of the key things you should be looking for the next few weeks? April 28th, very important. We need a continuing resolution to continue to fund the government, or we are going to have a government shutdown. Since we haven't got reconciliation for the ACA, or since the Republicans weren't able to use reconciliation before April 28th, there's not going to be a repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act this year. Could it be next year? Maybe. Are there going to be tweaks from HHS? Yes, and Larry will talk about some of those tweaks. But a full repeal and replace that could have happened if the Republicans had moved on that American Health Care Act is not going to happen in 2018. But again, as you're thinking to plan out in the future, corporate tax reform, we are seeing some momentum of that. Is it going to be 15%? Probably not. It's going to be closer to 20, 25, 28% maybe, and that's, again, maybe a late 2017 bill that actually could go through. On the individual tax side, not as bullish just because it's going to be hard to overcome some of the revenue drop that the president, that some economists feel would come from some of the president's ideas. And then things like paid leave. Just keep that in the back of your mind. That's something that has bipartisan support. We'll certainly find out more about that as this year comes. But that could also be a late 2017, early 18 type piece of legislation as well. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So we have a question, which is good. I even have a little ending spiel though. Now I don't know what to do. But but that was I'm nervous. That hand went right up. All I was going to say, I should have just taken it, was I have a real Sun Life. We have Workday for our sort of HRS system. Real Workday goal is to increase my LinkedIn followers. So I certainly would appreciate a follow on LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn blog, which is sort of embarrassing. But I try to post stuff on here. Hopefully you've seen I try to keep it as down the middle as possible. But I'm also not in sales at Sun Life, so you'll never get any direct messages from me trying to sell you some weird thing. And I'm a reciprocal LinkedIn follower, so I try to like and share your stuff as well. So I certainly would appreciate a follow on LinkedIn. But yes, so there definitely was at least one question. But I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll turn it back over to Bill, and we'll move on. But yes.
So I actually had to completely ask the question. So a while ago, you guys took over my PNC business, and they came in and they did a full-on risk analysis of my business, of where I was exposed to risk in order to reduce my rates. Why is nobody doing this in health insurance? Why is it that these 20 million people that you say are at risk of losing their health insurance, they're really the ones that are causing the cost to go up, because they have no incentive to behave in a healthy manner. They have no incentive to reduce their risk or the risk to everybody else that they create. And I work in wellness now, and I look at the IDC 10s for for TPAs, and I look at the data and say, okay, this person had a car accident. Not much we can do there in terms of wellness unless they're obese, which usually obese people take 50% longer to heal. But if this person has diabetes, there's definitely things we can do to reduce their risk in the future. But why is nobody doing that in health insurance?
It's
why is it not even a proposal in the government? I mean, there's nothing.
Yeah, I would say wellness in the public insurance world is not the private insurance industry has, and I should say different. The employer-sponsored health insurance world does a tremendously better job on wellness than, say, Medicaid, or even you can argue Medicare, or anything on the public exchanges. That's really not, that's almost like a 201 type step. And the challenge that the government has right now is with the 101 type step of how do we even create a risk pool that's something that insurance companies want to come in and sell their regular forget about like wellness, getting them healthy, just regular individuals to enroll in. It's a fair point. Certainly in conversations that I have with congressional staff, things like wellness and improving Medicaid and well, let me take a different way to answer that. If you look at what the American Health Care Act, particularly on Medicaid in particular, and Secretary Price has been very clear with this, and it again depends on if you're sort of where you sit on the political fence, but the American Health Care Act would have cut, call it $800 billion from Medicaid's budget. And the reason for that is there's thinking on the Republican side that the challenges with Medicaid today are that it's a one-size-fits-all program. And the federal government has put, this is what Medicaid's going to look like. In states, if you want your reimbursement, you're going to have to follow the procedures that we put in place, and this is what it's going to look like. And it's a little more complex than that. And so the Republican idea is a little bit different. And it's a little bit of a different answer to your question. It's, let's go to Illinois and say, Illinois, we're going to give you a check to run your Medicaid program. You figure out how you want to run it. You could do a much better job than us in D.C. deciding these are the things you have to put in Medicaid. And so that was one huge cost savings from the American Health Care Act, was changing the reimbursement structure of Medicaid. And Secretary Price has said, we shouldn't, he would be mad the way I was saying this, because he would say, you shouldn't look at that $800 billion numbers. We should be looking at outcome-based results versus what things actually cost, because we're spending a lot of money today, and to your point, some of the public programs aren't necessarily providing better outcomes. And so the idea would be if the states had more, maybe they couldn't put more, wellness type or other type incentives to run their programs better, but if we focus more on outcomes versus what we're paying into the system, that would be better. So it's not a great answer to your question, I understand that. But again, the government's at almost, they're level one. It's just trying to figure out, how do we create an insurance market that works? And how do we maybe move to a more outcome-based system? But things that are happening in the private insurance market, or the employer-based system, I should say, around wellness and really focusing on, and you folks know this 100 times better than me, really incenting your employees to do good things and follow good behaviors so that they'll have better healthy outcomes. That's something that certainly the private sector has done better than the public side. So that was, I've never got that question before, so I was a little stumbling. But it's a fair point. But that's interesting. But again, if you look at the speaker later today, we'll talk about some of what the American Health Care Act was talking about. Medicaid is a good example of trying to shift the focus from outcome-based or to outcome-based versus what we're actually putting into the system. Yes, less money was going to go into the Medicaid system, but the idea was states would have more flexibility, and that would actually create better outcomes. Again, so it really depends on what side, the aisle, and what you believe, and how much you know. The only other thing I'd say, and then I'm just going to take one question because Bill looks like he's going to murder me. So, so one thing I've found out, and I think it's important to remember, and I'm not saying this is right either, but you walk out of a congressman's office and you're meeting with their staff and things like that, and there's like 50 other people that are going. There's a plastics guy there's this big plastics issue that's the most important thing to the plastics industry, and then there's someone for crop insurance, and this is the most important thing. The more you can get in front of people, if you have ideas, the staff's actually open to things. And I've heard more in the last 2 months of people saying, hey, like, if you have ideas, like, please tell us what they are, because we're looking for solutions. We know it's not working. So, I mean, I know it sounds sort of cliche, but the more involved you can be in the legislative process, if you're passionate about it, I'm not like I have no skin in the game if you are or you aren't, but believe it, it actually does, it actually can have more influence than you would think. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill. But thank you very much. I appreciate the time. It was a good question. And again, I'd love a follow on LinkedIn. But thank you very much.